to switch them on.
Am I blocking the map?
No.
No.
Okay, good morning, everyone. I hope you all have coffee and croissants and get comfortably seated. Today we will talk about Yemen and the current crisis in Yemen, which is one of the main humanitarian disasters in the world today, but it's also a country and a region that people actually know very little about, due to lacking or random media coverage, and also because it's usually not very heavily covered in the curricula of Middle Eastern studies or regional studies. So luckily today I have with me two experts who will try to make a little bit sense of the country. The first is Daniel Varisco. He's an anthropologist historian who has conducted a lot of ethnographic research in Yemen, and he has done a series of thorough analysis of the Rasulid era in Yemen, especially on agriculture. He has published several books. I think perhaps the one that people might be familiar with is Islam Obscured, which has been on the curricula, but also on Orientalism, and numerous articles and publications on Yemen. He is currently a senior fellow at the Anne-Marie Schimmel Colleague in Bonn. He will be in Princeton from September onwards, and is also the president of the American Institute for Yemeni Studies. We have also with us Eirik Hovden, who is a postdoc at the Department of Arabic here in Bergen. He's formerly at the Wissenschaftskolleg in Vienna, but he did his PhD here in Bergen. He also has substantial research experience in Yemen, both for his MA, I think, and his PhD. His PhD was recently published in 2018 under the title Waqf in Yemen. My name is Anne Bang. I am also a historian, professor of history, African Islamic history. I've also done research in Yemen, but I kind of moved into the diaspora. But these two have also in common not only their interest in water management and experience in Yemen, but also the practice of combining anthropological fieldwork with textual sources. We shall see where our conversation leads us. What we were trying to do today is to say first something about Yemen. What kind of country is it? Who lives there? Then we'll move on to the current crisis and situation, and then try to raise some question of what could be the way out of the current problem. I want to turn first to geography and demography. Let's just start there. Since few people are actually familiar with this. So I want to start with Dan. How does the geography and environmental context play into the current crisis? Is geography even relevant here?
Well, first of all, thank you very much, both to Anna and to Eirik, for this opportunity to come and speak about Yemen. Let me ask the question first. How many, if you were asked to locate Yemen on a map, I mean, I know you're seeing one right here. Is there anyone that might have difficulty? Okay, so you have a general idea where it is at the bottom of the Arabian Peninsula. As you can see on this map, the Red Sea over there, along the coast, it's hot and dry and flat. And in terms of how that impacts the war, if you've been following, you know that over the past year, the forces allied with the Saudi coalition have been working their way up towards Hodeidah. And it's relatively easy to do because it's flat land. But then after about 50, 60 kilometers, you start to go into an extremely high mountain range. The highest point on the Arabian Peninsula, 3,600 meters above sea level, is in there. And it's very difficult to go up into the highlands. No easy way to go. Generally, it's along the major wadis. A wadi is, you might say, a river without water all the time, only after the major floods. And then once you get past the mountains, you have these, in Sana'a, going in the north, going down to Ib and Taiz, these mountain valleys. And particularly in the southern part, there's a lot of agriculture. And then if you were to go in this area and continue to the east, you go to Marib, and that you get into this so-called empty quarter, desert, which is what most of Saudi Arabia is. Yemen is very different geographically than Saudi Arabia. But then if you go down, again, you have a coastal zone along the Gulf of Aden here. And then you have this area over here of the Hadramaut, which is sort of by itself. It's sort of off in the corner. So there are a lot of different regions in Yemen. Historically, it was a very, very difficult country to take over. There were certainly attempts. In the 1930s, Ibn Saud, as he was expanding the Saudi state, took control of Najran, which you can see up there, and also some of this other area that had been under Yemen. And I'll just say this, that Ibn Saud, his troops came into Hodeidah, and they were on their way up to Sana'a, and then he encountered the difficulty of overcoming Yemen's tribes and the terrain, and he is quoted as saying, "No one will ever conquer Yemen." But unfortunately, I think the current king and his son don't remember what Ibn Saud said. So that's part of it. So it's not an easy place to wage a war.
So you mentioned that Ibn Saud encountered the Yemeni tribes. I think I can turn that question onwards to Eirik. Who are the Yemenis? What is the population of Yemen? We know it's 29 million
yeah,
people.
almost 30 million.
But who are they?
So just to latch on to the demography issue. So if we think about the Arabian Peninsula, it kind of looks like Saudi Arabia is the biggest, but in terms of population, Yemen is actually the biggest, especially if you don't count the guest workers in Saudi Arabia. So it's not just a corner of the peninsula when it comes to demography. So especially in the highlands, the population were, and to a large extent still are, organized in tribes. So these tribes are not nomads. They never were nomads. So we say that they are sedentary. They lived in certain geographical areas, and they mainly lived and still live from agriculture. Then we have, of course, an increasingly growing urban population, but it's still, the urban population is still smaller than the rural population. And it's a very young population. I think the median age is something like 19 years. And it's one of the fastest growing population, at least was before the war. So Yemen has a really special demography that's important to understand.
So let us turn to the current situation. The war in Yemen has now been ongoing for 4 years. But could we maybe turn to a little bit how this crisis evolved? What was actually behind it? What happened? Dan?
Well, one of the problems we face as historians, even if we're dealing with the modern period, is when is it meaningful to start talking about what led to the current crisis? So I will pick something that is meaningful in my mind, which is the beginning of what we call the Houthi movement. And in order to understand that, in 1980, you had an influx of a Salafi Wahhabi perspective from Saudi Arabia in the very far north, near Sada. Now, Sada traditionally was the seat of the Zaydis. The Zaydis, of course, are a branch of what we call Shia Islam, but they're very different than the Shia that are in Iran. They're very different than the Ismaili. So, we have to be very careful when we talk about them. At any rate, this Salafi perspective came in and basically said, look, the Zaydis are not proper Muslims. And the rise of the Houthi movement was in response to this imported idea that they weren't the right kind of Muslims. And there was a fellow named Hussein al-Houthi. He and his father had been to Iran. They did not become the type of Shia that are in Iran, but they picked up some ideas, particularly the anti-Americanism. And al-Houthi was in parliament. He was very much against the president who had been Ali Abdullah Saleh, eventually was in power for 3 decades, and the way that President Saleh was, allowing the Americans to operate. And so Saleh was upset by that, and he had Hussein al-Houthi killed. That generated 6 wars between the army of Ali Abdullah Saleh and the residents up there in the north. A lot of people were displaced, people were killed. It really antagonized the local tribes. And then all of a sudden we have the Arab Spring. Ali Abdullah Saleh loses power because the army split, right? Part of it was with him, part of it went with another general, Ali Muslim. And the Houthis sort of sat back. And then, of course, they eventually did something that's amazing. Ali Abdullah Saleh was the enemy of the Houthis. No question about it. He killed their founder. They made a Faustian bargain with Ali Abdullah Saleh. So joining with the troops of Ali Abdullah Saleh, they were able to come in and take over Sana'a. And at that time, there was this interim president, Hadi, right, who he was the only candidate, and it was just an idea. We have an interim, then we have a real election. And as you know, Hadi originally was there, he was replaced, he escaped, and when he escaped, the Saudis started this bombing campaign. So that's sort of how we got into this. It's a combination of factors, of the Saudi influence coming in, of the instability that came through the Arab Spring, and then this Faustian bargain where the Houthis and the tribes allied with them went with Ali Abdullah Saleh's troops.
I'm going to raise a question now that is of particular interest to me, so I leave it to any of you to answer. But this also, does the unification of the North and South have anything at all to do with the current crisis, or is that something that is already over and done with? Eirik?
You want me? Okay. So in 1990, North and South Yemen. North Yemen was a republic. South Yemen was the People's Democratic Republic of Yemen, socialist in name, shall we say. They united, the two countries. Ali Abdullah Saleh was the president, and Ali Salam al-Bayd, the president of the South, was the vice president. And everyone was so hopeful. A couple things happened that were problematic. One of them is that almost very soon after that was, of course, the Gulf War. And the Yemenis actually tried to broker an agreement rather than have the war against Saddam Hussein. But because they didn't join the coalition, the Saudis and the people in the Gulf sort of ostracized Yemen and sent back as many as 800,000 to 1 million Yemeni men who were working in Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, and it was their money, their remittances, that was basically fueling development in Yemen. So from the very beginning there was a problem, and the political problem. And in the political problem, in a couple of years there was a civil war, and the South was really exploited. People were killed, land was grabbed. And the people in the South were really, really angry. And there was a secessionist movement that began in the early 2000s. So you now have a situation where it's not simply there's a war coming in, right, from the outside of the Saudi coalition. But there are these grievances which continue. There are many people in the south who don't want to have anything to do with the Yemenis in the north. They're afraid of what had happened before. And just one other item is that, of course, and this map, by the way, it's from a while ago. We just put it up here so you would have a general sense. But, you know, when it says pro-Hadi, there are very few people who are pro-Hadi. They could be anti-Houthi. And what happens is that Hadi is not even in control of this area around Aden. Because 2 years ago, about 2 years ago, a Southern Transitional Council was established when Hadi tried to fire, to get rid of the governor at that time of Aden, and the governor said, well, I don't need you. So there are competing factions still going on because of that secessionist issue.
So bear with us, because the Yemeni situation is extremely complex. There are so many groups and so many histories that play out in this, which you, with a simple word, might call a civil war. But it's actually many civil wars. Or what would you, are the Houthis actually waging a civil war? Would you say that, Eirik?
Let me just start with a tiny follow-up that when you think of the north and the south, you think of two equal parts somehow, but the population in the north is far bigger than the population in the south. So it is a kind of unequal or unbalanced conflict or regional division. Sorry, what was the question?
No, my question was really. Would you say that the Houthis see themselves as engaged in a civil war?
Definitely not, because seen with the eyes of the Houthis, the threat or the aggression comes from the outside, you know, from the Saudis and their allies. That's the short answer of that. Yeah.
So another group that I'm almost going to say, unfortunately, have to speak about, which is the one that has actually got some media coverage, and which you see on the map here, is Al-Qaeda. What are they doing there?
There's a lot of misunderstanding about this group we call Al-Qaeda. There was at one point a version of Al-Qaeda that evolved in Yemen. It was actually called Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. And the reason for that is that some of the architects of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula were actually from Saudi Arabia. And it was just easier to operate. They don't call themselves Al-Qaeda anymore, by the way. So they have changed their tactics. At first it was, as we know from the bombing of the USS Cole, there were these individuals who came back from Afghanistan to Yemen, and that was anti-American and anti-against the government of Saleh, that was, of course, allied with the Americans. And because of the turmoil that happened during the Arab Spring, they were able to take over this area down here in the south, in Zanzibar, and going up even into Atak. And they were able to, they didn't carve out a caliphate, and they weren't even interested in that, but they had a lot of influence. And this has continued more or less, even with the recent, coming of the Emirati. Well, I need to say something here, and that is that when we talk about the war going on, most of the fighters on the Saudi Emirati side are Yemeni. They're mercenaries. The Emiratis and the Saudis pay Yemenis to fight Yemenis. Some of them are Yemenis who had been in Saudi Arabia. Others are poor. There are a lot of child soldiers on both sides, from 13 years old or so. There are also mercenaries from Sudan, from Senegal, American mercenaries. So it's a very, very complicated situation in that sense. But they did change the way they were operating. and realize that you can't just come in and completely change the way people practice Islam. Here in the South, and certainly Anna knows something about this, the people were more oriented towards a Sufi perspective. They weren't Salafi. Okay, there are some now, but basically they weren't. So this was a very different kind of Islam that was being imposed on them, and so there was resistance. But and when we look at this map here, this is supposed to be the areas back in 2018 where Al-Qaeda had an impact. It's not as though they controlled that area, or even do so today, but they could operate within that area and cause problems. So they are certainly a factor as we go forward.
I think that brings us on to the second topic of the day, because if we hear anything at all about the current situation in Yemen, it's usually about the Saudi airstrikes. That is what gains coverage with the destruction of houses and so on. But both of you have contacts on the ground, and I'm really wondering what is actually the warfare happening. We've heard about the blockade of Hodeidah, but certainly all these troops, the Yemeni mercenaries, the Sudanese and Senegalese mercenaries, what are they doing? What is happening on the ground in Yemen in terms of warfare? Both of you.
Yeah. When Dan talked about, for example, Al-Qaeda, it really has a certain geographical dimension to it, and a lot of what is going on have a geographical limitation. So, and that's the same with the warfare, and that's also why we suggested to have a map. And the fronts on the ground have been almost still since the war started. Mm-hmm. They hardly moved. So you see the blue area here is where most of the population live, is the Houthi-controlled area. And most of the military action on the ground has happened along the front of this area. Especially the city of Taiz has been sitting on the front for almost 4 years now.
Mm-hmm. So that means that this Saudi forces with the mercenaries, they are on the ground on this front.
They are on the ground on this front.
Okay.
Yes. Mm. That's the short answer. Yeah.
And in addition, there are local militias and there are tribal militias, so you have a number of players. It's not simply that there's these foreigners coming in and they're mercenaries, because as was pointed out by Eirik, Yemen is still very much tribal, and there's a lot of misunderstanding about what it means to be tribal. And Eirik was totally correct to say these are sedentary tribes. If you're a sedentary tribe, you have to protect your land, so you tend not to have the kind of feuding. And sort of fighting that goes on among the Bedouin that we think about when we think about Arabia. And as a result, there has evolved within Yemen a customary tribal law that is heavy on negotiation and reconciliation, because you want to resolve things before they expand and cause real problems. But at the same time, you defend your own territory. You very much defend your own territory. So in addition to whatever the foreign interests are, it's like, this is our territory. And what has historically happened, and you can trace this going all the way back, is that the tribes, their primary interest is their own territory. And if it's to their advantage to ally with this group as opposed to that group, they will probably do that. It's not as though they're either going to be pro-Saudi or whatever it happens to be. And the other thing is a misunderstanding of the Houthis. It's a family, okay, but it's the tribes that support them. It's the tribal militias that support them, just as it's the former army, most of the former army that supports them. And when they came, it's interesting to think about this. When they came into Sana'a, they were welcomed. Because Hadi was corrupt, he was hated. They were welcomed. There really wasn't much fighting going on, except with General Ali Mohsen, who was, against. He was the one who led the attacks on the Houthis. And if this had, in a way, it's no different than what Sisi did in Egypt. But in Egypt, we say, oh, that's fine, even though he slaughtered all these supporters of a democratically elected president, whether you like him or not, Morsi. And there was no slaughter when the Houthis came in. They didn't, and in fact, the reports are, and this is when they came in, I'm not saying they're the same today, they would go into a ministry and say to the minister, you're not going to be corrupt anymore, you're not going to take bribes anymore. So people were actually thinking, oh, this is sort of good. But, of course, there's a lot of baggage that goes with that. And the situation has changed. 4 years, things change. Ideas change, people change.
And the lives of Yemenis have changed.
Oh, gosh.
We can maybe move on a little bit to the consequences this war has had for the people of Yemen. And that's also quite unequally distributed.
Yeah.
According to where the front lines are and so on. Maybe, I don't know, Eirik, you want to say something about the situation in the highlands that you know best?
Well, of course, the people who live along the front line has been mostly affected in terms of, having to flee their homes and so on. People would had to flee their homes because of airstrikes and so on, of course, also, but the action on the ground has been tough for several areas along the fronts. Then you have the general blockade that the coalition forces have been able to effectuate. So most import has to be done through the port of Hodeida, which is
there.
It's now have been fighting there for a long time, and negotiations about that, and actually the UN has put its foot down and said to the coalition that you are not allowed to take Hodeida, and because it needs to be open for the import of food. Most of the food to Yemen now needs to be imported, and it's imported as emergency aid. Because of the blockade and the general war economy that has started to take new forms, and warlords and certain individuals and groups are benefiting on this new economy, the prices have risen astronomically. The prices for food, wheat, for fuel, medicines, medical services. So in addition to a lot of very dramatic changes for a certain part of the population and outright war, you also have a general simple, how can I say, when the prices increase, even the middle class starts to feel poor. But at the same time, I think we can say that it's not a general situation where everyone starves. We're not talking about that either. And the middle class who still have money and some income, they can still get access to most things. It just costs a lot more than before. The problem is for the many, many poor, and Yemen is the poorest country in the MENA region. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a reason why it is called the worst humanitarian crisis, man-made, person-made humanitarian crisis in the world. If you want to see the statistics, you can go to the UN website of OCHA, the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Aid, where 24 million out of the 28 or 29, whatever it is, are in need of some sort of humanitarian assistance. 9 million people are on the brink of famine. Okay, the food insecurity is incredible. You've had the cholera epidemic. Last October, it was 1,300,000 people who had that were known to have cholera. In March, WHO said that every day 2,000 new cases of cholera were being reported. There's been a tremendous death toll on children, particularly under 5. I think at one point UNICEF said 1,200 children a day were dying. There's a new report out from the UN that says that if the current crisis continues, by the year 2020, it's not very far away, the number of people who have died, either from the direct impact of the war or because of health consequences and lack of food, will be 233,000 people. Now, for a long time, throughout the first, I think it was about 2 years ago or so, the UN said 10,000. And every media report was 10,000, 10,000. A couple of years went by and it was 10,000. A lot more than 10,000 people have been killed in this war. And part of this is because of a media blitz. The Saudis and the Emiratis have hired some of the best PR firms in the world to promote their point of view and to keep, and as you were saying at the very beginning, the media very seldom covers what is really happening and going on. So there's a really bad humanitarian crisis. But I want to say something about the resilience of the Yemeni people, because I have friends in Yemen who tell me these remarkable stories. So because at one point it was so expensive to buy food, some merchants, some grocers were reducing the price. Reducing the price. Can you imagine that happening anywhere else? That's sort of amazing. And then we talked about the number of people who are displaced. It's well over 3 million people who are displaced. Now, they're either going in with relatives or other people are taking them in, and now, of course, many don't have anywhere to go. So we don't really understand the resilience of the Yemeni people to come together, because they have this history of cooperation. That's the nature of a tribal system. You really do take care of each other.
Within the tribe or across as well? It
can be both. It's first within the tribe, but there are links. You don't always marry someone, for example, in your own tribal group. And we can't forget the role of Islam. We haven't really talked about that here. But if you are seriously into the principles and the values of Islam, you certainly don't act the way that Mohammed bin Salman is acting. And I'm not saying the Houthis are any better. Let me make this clear. There are no good guys. The blame is on all sides. And Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International have documented violations of human rights, of war crimes. One of the first war crimes, you see that city of Saada up there? It has been blanket bombed. This is a town. But near the beginning of the war, the Saudis said, we consider it, the whole town, the whole city, we consider it a military zone. You can't do that. Cluster bombs have been found. So we know something about that. But also, journalists have been picked up by the Houthis and arrested. This is what happens in insecurity and war. They're no good guys. And that's what's making it difficult for what's going to happen in the future.
Yeah, let us turn that way before we open for question and answers. There was an attempt in Stockholm to negotiate a so-called ceasefire, which was broken within how long? A week or?
Pretty soon.
Pretty soon. And since that time, the stalemate has more or less been there in place. Who was at the table there in Stockholm, and who do you think should be at the table? How can there be a negotiated settlement in what is a civil war but not really a civil war? How do you do that?
You want to talk about Stockholm? You're closer than I am.
I can just mention that the UN invited, I don't remember the exact name, but a union of the Yemeni women association to attend. As many find it important to have a diversity of actors present in such negotiations, but both parties rejected to have them at the table. Yeah.
What do you mean both parties? The Saudis and
the Houthis. Yeah.
And the Houthis. So the two parties were the Saudis and the Houthis.
In Stockholm, the main parties negotiating are the Houthis and the coalition side. Yeah.
Should anybody else have been there, you think?
Well, then there was Geneva. In Geneva, that was a more recent, I think, where again the women were excluded and the youth are excluded. And the youth were some of the prime motivators of the original Arab Spring protests against Ali Abdullah Saleh, as were women. Of course, you know that a Yemeni woman, Mutawakil Karman, received the Nobel Prize. She wasn't the only one. And maybe we should say a little bit about gender. Most people say, oh, obviously it's a Middle Eastern country, the women are exploited. And of course, if you see under the Houthis, they now have this almost like in Afghanistan, total, it's called a sharshaf in Yemen. When I was there in the 1970s, first of all, the sharshaf was not a complete thing. It didn't cover your face, and it generally went down to only about here. And it was urban women. Not the country women. Country women are out in the fields working. And so they certainly weren't in that situation. But Yemeni women are very, very strong. They are very opinionated, particularly in rural areas, right? They're not like their Saudi sisters. I'll tell an anecdote. So my wife and I went to do ethnographic research, and we were living in a tribal area to the northwest of the capital. And, I'm mainly, like Eirik, I'm interested in agriculture and water and irrigation. And so I'm in the fields every day. And when we're there, I'm always seeing women, and I didn't know, should I greet them? How should I respond? And several of the women went to my wife, who's also an anthropologist, and said, in your country, don't they greet people? She said, well, of course. Well, what's wrong with your husband? He said, oh, he's shy, he doesn't know. And you know what they said? They said, tell him we're not Saudi. Right? And that was 1970s. Now, I don't like the fact of the way women they don't have the types of freedom that they used to have. But we should be very careful not to think that women are as exploited in Yemen as they certainly are in Saudi Arabia. One of my colleagues when I taught at Qatar University was Hatun al-Fassi. She is a Saudi woman. She was speaking up for human rights. I would hesitate to call her a feminist. Okay, she has been in prison for over a year. She is now temporarily out to visit her family. It's not clear whether she will be allowed to continue. That doesn't happen in Yemen. Yemen's first minister of human rights was a woman. And there are currently women in the cabinet of Hadi. So, we have to, gender is very important to consider here.
One of the other issues in the Yemen crisis has been that Western governments seemingly have had a lot of trouble landing on what should be their actual policy. Who should be supported in this kind of situation? And I know that both of you have said that one should actually support whatever groups that can build the Yemeni future. Eirik, you suggested, for example, intellectuals and scholars and education in Yemen.
Well, of course, now, naturally, the priority is on the humanitarian assistance and so on. But at the same time, that takes all the attention. And in order to get through this crisis and to somehow come out at the other end, one also needs to keep alive and to help and to aid those forces in Yemen who actually are working for a better future and who have been doing that for a long time. So yeah, you mentioned education, healthcare, civil society. All these actors are there, but they hardly get support. They hardly get scholarships into our, how can I say, education systems, they hardly get visas when they want to get out of Yemen. So we really need to change a lot when it comes to our policy towards civil society and I don't like to use the word intellectuals, but those who clearly have the resources or just need a bit more support from us, who can do a big difference in Yemen. Yeah, and they are there definitely.
Definitely. Dan, you want to add to that? Who should one support?
Well, give a little bit of historical background to what we're talking about here, is that in my mind, I mean, USAID, for example, I mean, many different development international organizations were involved in development, providing healthcare, providing education care, providing, you name it, in Yemen. Not always successful. But to my mind, the one program that USAID did that was great was sending Yemenis to the United States to get training, particularly in technical areas, but also in the social sciences, whatever. And those people would come back, trained, and they were almost always, because I was on an evaluation one time of this, pro-American. Almost always. In the Gulf War, 1990, USAID cut that completely. It's like cutting off your nose to spite your face, okay? And then our drone policy of going after, these so-called terrorists, and many of them, okay, were terrorists. So many civilians were killed in the process. So there was a rising anti-Americanism that wasn't there when I was there in the 70s. They liked America. America was God-fearing. They didn't like the Russians, in the North particularly, okay? So there is this background, historical background, where, we lost a chance by not continuing to train people to, who would be friendly, who would then come back. But I totally agree with Eirik. There is a civil society in Yemen, absolutely. And there are mechanisms for cooperation. There are mechanisms for resolving conflicts that have been going on for years and years. What we do not need is for someone to come in from the outside and say, well, you don't know what you're doing, we have a plan for you. The Yemenis have to be involved from the get-go of whatever development is going. And there's going to be a massive, assuming this thing ends, a massive pouring in of money. Although I do have Yemeni friends who are basically saying to the Saudis, we don't want your damn money, right? Leave us alone. You can sort of understand where they're coming from. And it's going to be dangerous, too, because one of the problems in international development is you can say, we're going to put all this money in, but absorbing it. It's not easy to absorb it. How you spread it out fairly. So it's going to be a difficult future, but I'm ultimately optimistic based on, and I can respond as well, to my understanding of the Yemeni people. I think, this war would end tomorrow if the US and Britain and others stopped their logistic aid to the Saudis. The Saudis could not operate this war without this external support. It would end right then. That's the reality. But it's, of course, not going to because of the various issues that are going on.
Final question. I'm not sure if it will be a more optimistic note to end on before we open for question and answer, but simple question, but difficult answer. I would pose it to both of you. Yemen, political analysts will tell you Yemen bears all the hallmarks of a failed state, fragmentation is happening, and now also a war. Will we see a united Yemen in the future, Eirik?
It never was that united in the first place, and you mentioned the failed state, but it never was a complete state in the first place. So some sort of regionalization or some sort of federal division or I mean the local regions in Yemen and the local communities are quite strong, and they have very strong structures there already. So there is no doubt that that will remain so for a long time. But the question is, how can one build a state-like entity, especially considering that the tribes, especially north and east of Sana'a, are heavily armed and have been so for forever.
Mm.
So the question of who should have the actual monopoly of violence is a crucial one, I think, and it's a very ideological one in the end. Yeah, I think in the question of how to make a state, and that is a question that the Yemenis need to solve.
Mm. Dan, what do you think?
Well, there was a GCC brokered plan that ended up with what was called the National Dialogue Conference after the removal of Ali Abdullah Saleh. And they actually laid out a blueprint, and the people in the National Dialogue Conference were representing pretty much all the different groups. The Houthis were there were people from the south, etc.
There were women groups.
There were women. The youth were not very well in there. But they were calling for a federal system with basically in the Sana'a being sort of like Washington, D.C., if you will, and then different federal states. The problem that actually caused the Houthis to come in was that on his own, Hadi decided to split Yemen up, which had like 13 or so different divisions, governorates, into 5. Totally landlocking the Houthis. I mean, no one liked it. And that sort of was the opportunity to create, this revolution that was then going to happen. I think ultimately the idea of a federal state is a possibility, but none of us really can predict what is going on. We can say that historically there was a civil war in the south, in the north, after the fall of the Zaydi Imamate. That took place in 1962, the overthrow. President Nasser of Egypt supported the republic. The Saudis supported the son of the Zaydi Imam. And that war went on until the late 1960s, okay? And it was resolved. And with no after effect, no Yemenis were killing Yemenis after that because of that war. They were able to work through that conflict. Now, I'm not saying it's the same situation, it's not. But I do hold out hope that if we leave the Yemenis to solve it themselves, I think they could. But the thing I really worry about is that the Saudis and the Emiratis have their own vision of how to control the future of Yemen. They do not want a democratic state. I mean, if there's a democratic state in Yemen, maybe people in the Emirates or in Kuwait or in Saudi Arabia might say, why do we still have these guys who go around buying $23 million mansions and yachts and have, really? So it's going to be tough.
On the paper, Yemen is a democratic state.
It is.
Yeah, yes.
It's a republic, and that's something very unusual on the Arabian Peninsula. And this is in people's minds as well. Yeah.
I think that's if only a slight optimistic note.
Slight.
To thank you both now for provisionally for now. We're going to open the floor for questions. I know there are so many things we have talked about and so many groups and details. There's also one thing we haven't talked about at all, which is the Yemeni system of political parties, for example. So any question you might have, please.
Thank you so much for the talk. It was really interesting. I have 2 questions. The first question is, what is the role of international law in the conflict? Like, is there any way that the actors who committed war crimes, like you mentioned in the city up north, is there any way that we can hold them accountable maybe after the conflict? And then secondly, in terms of like US foreign policy, both in the Middle East and in Yemen, as the US becomes less dependent on like Saudi oil and oil from other countries that are allied within the Middle East, is there any way that they can maybe take a stronger stance against the actions of the Saudi government? Maybe not under Trump, but if you get a new president in the future. Thank you.
Well, I guess since I have American citizenship, I need to respond to this. Yeah, things will hopefully change with the next election. Trump is of course not interested in oil. He's interested in selling weapons to the Saudis. But you have to remember that the Saudis are very heavily invested in the United States. They own a tremendous amount of property, as do people in the Gulf. And they own a tremendous amount of property in England. So, it's a complicated sort of issue. A lot of it depends on what happens in Saudi Arabia. Mohammed bin Salman, is trying to make some major changes, but he is very much an autocrat. Will he survive? Or will there be a palace coup, which has certainly happened before? So there are a lot of things we don't know. In terms of the issue about the war crimes, they've been well documented on all sides. Whether or not anyone will be held accountable, that's a tough one. And of course, in the negotiations to end the conflict, immunity will become important. So the negotiations that led to Ali Abdullah Saleh stepping down granted him immunity. And stupidly, and I mean unbelievably stupidly, they left Ali Abdullah Saleh in Yemen. Well, do you think this guy wasn't going to try and make a comeback? That's just beyond belief. So I think that it's way too early to tell what's going to happen. Most Americans just don't have a clue and don't care about something like that. So I don't know. You want to comment?
Not really, no.
I don't blame you.
Yes. The one thing interesting on this map, one of the things, is what Eirik said, is that the blue area hasn't really changed throughout the war, in spite of all that's happening militarily, but also in the composition, because you said that what started this thing was the Houthis and Saleh united. And what has happened in between is that Saleh, as for a couple of years ago, changed his tack and wanted to switch to the other side, and he was killed, and his forces were kicked out, and nothing happened. It's still blue, and it's still blue all the way down to Taiz and there. So my question is, why, and I think I've spoken to Eirik before, so he would say that, well, the reason is the tribes, the northern tribes, who are really behind it. So the question is it possible to kind of rule the Houthis out of the blue, definition of the blue, and talk of this as really being the traditional or the social basis for the North, which is what the blue thing is. And that could be then the basis for a solution of recognizing this not as the one party of the civil war, the Houthis, but that this is, the political force that is carrying the northern Yemen, and that's the one who should take over from what is now the Houthis. It should be recognized internationally.
Thank you for the question. The problem is that even the blue area is not as how can I say? It's not one block.
Yeah.
In the north and east of Sana'a, you have some very strong, militarily strong tribes. That area is quite poor in many ways. It doesn't receive so much rainfall. The agriculture is not so strong in the area. While on the other hand, west of Sana'a, you have some very, very fertile mountains where the tribal system is not so strong, but the population density is very high. A slightly different culture, one can say. And then you have a large urban population, and the population is also not as, how can I say, it's much more diverse now than 50 years ago, and of course much more diverse now than 20 years ago in terms of culture and access to the rest of the world. I mean, people have internet on their smartphones, and so yeah, the simple answer is it's not as homogeneous as it looks on the map. But it is true that this area is kind of the core area of historical Yemen. Now, many Yemenis around would protest, of course, but this is where most people live, and this is where the recent historical states have had their core areas, so the highlands of Yemen and the western mountains. And in the highlands, although there are some mountains in the west, the highlands themselves are quite flat, and communication is much easier up there. So so it is, yeah. It's yeah. Did I clarify your question?
Well, you seem to be negative to the idea that this actually could be the core of a solution.
There are too many challenges to that, because in the north, around Saada, that's really the core area of the Zaydi Islamic direction that we didn't talk so much about. While if you come south towards Ib, for example, which is also inside this core area, they are traditionally Shafi'i, Sunni. So and in between there are transition zones, not just in a binary way, but also in an ideological or religious way. That there is a long tradition of combining Zaydism and Shafi'ism or Sunnism in Yemen.
And I think that there's a danger, and it's something that is promoted by the media as though, you see these maps, either pro-Houthi or pro-Saudi. Not everyone in this Houthi area likes the Houthis, right? But they may hate the Saudis, you see. And the same, certainly, the area of pro-Hadi, most of them, the last thing they want is Hadi. But they don't like the Houthis, because the Houthis came down and tried to take Aden. They tried to take over the whole country. Okay, so that was a problem. And I think, as Eirik is saying, it's not at all homogeneous. And traditionally, yeah, there was the Zaydis and there was the Shafi'i. There's a small group of Ismailis up near up in the Haraz area. But the impact of Salafism and the impact of the Al-Qaeda and those kinds of groups has altered that dimension, plus the education of many people. So it's a very different, very heterogeneous context with a lot of, we didn't talk about political systems, but I mean, if we did, then we'd have to bring in the Muslim Brotherhood group, Islah, which is now being supported by the Saudis and which the Emiratis are furious about. There's a real rift between the Emirates and the Saudis about that. So
we have time for a final set of questions. We're basically out of time, but we'll...
Yes, thank you so much. The themes that keep on repeating itself within this presentation seem to be certain diversity and division, if I may. And my question is directly linked to the last question that was posed within the panel, that if we envision unanimous Yemen in the future, or historically it can be debatable as well, how meaningful it is to talk about one Yemen today. I think the monopoly of violence, state violence, was an excellent point. Another very practical example is administrative issues. A former colleague of mine is now moving to Yemen, and he is faced with the issue that he needs to travel between Aden and Sana'a. And because Aden is a Saudi allies controlled area and Sana'a is Houthi allies controlled area, so just obtaining the 2 visas that the country is requesting for these territories is difficult. So how meaningful it is to talk about one Yemen?
Well, there's really no choice but to become a nation state. They don't have a choice, right? You can't function in this world without being a nation state. Right now, it's a ridiculous situation because the government in exile has no power. And one of the things we didn't mention is that the salaries of government workers and teachers have not been paid for a couple of years, right?
Longer.
So it's not functioning.
Even longer.
Even longer in some cases. But they have to become some kind of a state. It's hard to imagine. I mean, this could go on for a while. It's not quite like Syria where Assad is still in power, right, and still has some control, even though he's lost control. It's not clear where the state is right now. I mean, the de facto state is primarily the Houthis, but there's more than one de facto state. Whether we go back to 2 nation states or whether we have a federation, I don't know, but it's going to have to be something that will have a seat in the United Nations, right?
Do we have a last question?
Yeah, I will try to make it as brief as possible. You were mentioning that the Western forces and their military support for Saudi Arabia-led intervention to stop is very unlikely. And I would my cursory understanding of the conflict and the ideology of the Houthi somehow has this strong anti-Western views against the US and especially against Israel. And I think that is a real barrier actually also for Western interventions to say, we don't need to suppress these rebel movements, right? And I thought this was a little bit not too much light on this fact, and I would like to hear your opinion, whether you see that in that way or whether this is perhaps exaggerated among journalists and in the news actually.
Well, you're referring to what's called the Sarha, which is from Iran, death to America, death to Israel, kill the Jews and whatever. And it's interesting, 2 things. One of them is, so we have American Institute for Yemeni Studies. We have an office in Sana'a that's still operating. I have a Yemeni in charge. And when the Houthis first came over, someone came in and tried to extort money from us, saying he was a Houthi. He wasn't really a Houthi. He was trying to extort money. And my executive director knew some people high up in the Houthi movement, and they stopped this person, right? When the American ambassador left, he was protected, I don't know of any Americans as such who have been harmed by the Houthis. And I am told, it's just, there are some people who are really into it, but it's not really the main motivating factor. I mean, it's disturbing. Absolutely, it's disturbing. But it's an imported idea, and I'm not sure it has that much resonance. Most Yemenis are concerned about themselves. Israel is, not a big issue for them. So there's that. But it is a problem. We have created antipathy to war. I mean, the United States because of our actions. And certainly that they, when that bomb that went and destroyed that school bus was from the United States, you can understand the antagonism. So it is going to be very difficult. But I don't think that they're going to just hate America forever, unless we continue to give them good reasons to do that.
Thank you. I think we need to end there because our time is up. I would like to thank our 2 panelists, Dan and Eirik. Thank you. And I would like to thank the audience for coming and joining us this morning. And I want to remind you that Bergen Global has a whole, every week, more or less every week, interesting talks going on here. So please follow Bergen Global on social media and hope to see you back here.